Jenna says, I love a good story, and I've spent nearly 15 years telling them as a journalist, marketing professional, and most recently as a podcaster. She hosts and produces the Democracy Works podcast, which is a collaboration between the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State and WPSU Penn State, Central Pennsylvania's NPR station. When she's not podcasting, she plans and executes all of the McCourtney Institute's external communications. She also teaches journalism in Penn State's Donald P. Belisario's College of Communications and works with national and international clients as a freelance writer and a marketer. So without further ado, let's welcome Jenna to the virtual stage.
All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for that introduction, Ariel. Super excited to be here with the Outlier family. This is my third Outlier presentation. I presented at the summit in Austin at this time last year, and then at Salt Lake City, which was just back in January, but feels like it was an eternity ago, those heady pre-COVID-19 days. But I'm super excited to be here with all of you today at the virtual summits for, I guess, what is my hat trick Outlier presentation. I don't know. I know like the least about sports of anybody you know. I can guarantee you that. So hopefully I got that sports metaphor right. Please correct me in the chat if I didn't. But today I'm going to talk about what I think is a bit of a different approach to marketing and audience development as a podcaster. It is a question that comes up a lot. And this is not going to be like 10x growth hacking type of approach. I have no disrespect for folks that come out of that school of thought, but it's just not where, not the background I come from, as Ariel said. My background is in journalism, and so that's how I approach things, thinking about good old-fashioned shoe leather audience development work. So if anybody has seen the film Spotlight, or even going all the way back to something like All the President's Men, good reporters get out there, they talk to people, they are out just putting themselves out there, making connections, building genuine connections with people, really a quality approach as opposed to quantity. I feel like a lot of discussion around podcasts tends to be about download numbers and just more. But that doesn't necessarily translate to a quality audience and the connections that we're all looking for as indie podcasters, right? So most of us are not doing this as part of a big media company or something that we're going to like get rich on, right? It is a passion project as much as anything. So you need to be able to connect with the people who are just as passionate as you are about the topics that you're talking about on your show. And we're going to go over some strategies for how to do that. So a little bit about me to get started. This is where you can find me. As Ariel mentioned, I do have a journalism background and continue to teach journalism. I also do a lot of freelance writing and marketing. And bonus points, if anybody knows what this font is, it is not Comic Sans, although it does look like it. I realize that. But if you know what this font is or want to do some quick Googling, put it in the chat. Maybe we'll do a giveaway or something at the end. But you'll have plenty of chance to see it on the slide as we go throughout the presentation. That's where you can find me online. I'll reiterate my contact information at the end as well. So my podcast, Democracy Works, has been going for about 2 years. At a very high level, it covers what it means to live in a democracy. So democracy is a very broad term, which is why we are 2 years in, over 100 episodes, and still haven't even scratched the surface of all the things we could talk about. Some of our episodes are, I'd say, pretty high level topics, but things like neoliberalism and demagoguery. A lot of our guests are academics or other types of experts. But some are more kind of tangible topics, things like mail-in voting is a big topic right now. So we've done some episodes on that. How COVID-19 is impacting the census. There's so many interesting angles out there. It's just been a joy to learn along the way as we've done the show. I didn't know anything about this stuff when I started, but I came into it with that reporter's curiosity and that interest in learning more, and it's carried through throughout our show. And we are part of the Democracy Group podcast network. So if anybody listened to Katie DiFiore's presentation last night, we're happy to be part of that effort with a lot of other like-minded podcasts. So the number one question, you guys have seen it in Facebook groups and articles, and I'm sure there's lots of sessions at this conference and others, of course, about how do you get more listeners? It's the thing everybody wants to know, because we all put this time and energy and money into making our shows, and what good are they if no one's going to listen, right? So there's usually some pretty conventional advice or conventional tactics I've seen people take over my course of 2 years or so in the podcast world. One is, make some social accounts for your show, and then generate your quote graphics and your headliner posts and all that other stuff that goes with it, and just blast it out over and over and over again, every hour, forever and ever, amen, right? So, and you see a lot of, podcast accounts out there that have like 100 followers, and they just do nothing but send stuff out, blast it out over and over again. And I know it's really easy. You could just schedule stuff to go out, and there's lots of tools out there that make all that process pretty easy. And I'm sure there is some return that comes from it. But again, it shouldn't be the only thing that you're doing in terms of growing your audience. A lot of folks also go right to like social media advertising, for example, or traditional media. And there is also, again, value in that. Obviously, advertising is advertising for a reason, because it's great at getting attention. And if you're trying to build something new in the world, whether that's a podcast or not, you need to get that attention from somewhere. But it can quickly be a money suck to, spend all this money and not really have that what you would expect as a good return for that. So it's another piece of conventional advice. Or you can be that person that's in like every self-promotion Tuesday thread, whether that's on Facebook or Twitter or on Reddit, whatever communities you're part of. And again, sometimes those things make an impact, but if you look at those threads, usually there's like hundreds of people there. And I don't know, maybe there are people out there that, listeners that comb through those looking for recommendations. But from what I've observed anyway, it seems to just be a lot of podcasters talking to each other, which is something I'll get to later. I think it's really incumbent upon all of us to figure out how to bring new listeners into the podcast space, because there are more and more shows coming online every day. And if we don't do our part to increase the listener base, everybody's slice of the pie is just going to keep shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. So I did all of those things and still do some of them, frankly. But about a year or so ago, not long after my first Outlier presentation, actually, I had a bit of a light bulb moment. So I started thinking about all the skills that I learned as a journalist in terms of going out and cultivating sources, and how you think about your beat and everything that you're an expert in, and how that kind of intersected with the marketing work that I was trying to do for my show. And I realized that the two were not as separate as I maybe had them in my mind. If you think about it like a Venn diagram, that spot in the middle was actually pretty substantial. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So I would encourage all of you to adopt a journalist's mindset when it comes to thinking about how to promote your show. Doesn't matter if you've never spent a day as a journalist in your life, or don't have any inclination to be one. You don't have to actually go out and be a reporter or any of those types of things. It's just a mindset you adopt. And that includes digging for information, making connections, talking to strangers, being curious, and building relationships with your sources, whether that's individual listeners or some cross-promotional partners that we'll talk about at the end. And so this is, as I said, really a quality approach as opposed to quantity, with the idea being that if you do all of these things, you're going to find people who are more likely to be interested in exactly what you're talking about, and not only are they going to listen to your show, but they're going to come back and listen again. They're going to subscribe. They're going to tell their friends about it. They're going to share it in whatever circles they're in. They're hopefully going to become evangelists for your show. But all of that starts with adopting this kind of journalist like approach to your content. So in the reporting world, many reporters have something called a beat, which is the area that they cover, generally what they become sort of an expert in, not to the extent that, somebody who has a PhD or something is an expert, but, if somebody covers the White House, for example, they know a lot about the inner workings of what goes on there. If somebody covers climate change, they are talking to climate scientists all the time, as well as advocates in the field. If somebody covers education, they're up on all the latest trends and all of these kind of things. So really, your show, whatever it is, that's kind of like your beat. That's like the thing you know best, or at a minimum, you have something to say about it. You have an opinion, you have a thought, you have other people on to talk about whatever that topic is. So for me, it's democracy. There's a whole community out there of democracy reform organizations, of people out there doing work to improve access to voting and working on problems like gerrymandering, all of those kind of things. I saw a question come in the chat. Let me see if I can get out to it here for a second.
I can read it to you. It's more of a comment.
Great. Okay.
Eric says, as someone who was going to school for journalism before moving to the IT world and development, this really hits home. Great presentation.
Oh, great. Thanks, Eric. Okay, so as I was saying, your show is your beat. It's what you know best, what you're going to be able to go out there and find. And so step one is that digging for information. So I was just saying, there's this whole democracy reform space out there that I've kind of become part of over the past 2 years. What does that look like for your show? What are the communities out there? Are there places on Reddit? We'll talk about Reddit in a couple minutes. Are there groups that meet in real life, or whatever IRL looks like these days? Are there meetups? Is it age specific? If your show is for kids or seniors or something like that, there might be things like that. Who can you partner with? Are there nonprofits or businesses or schools? Who can you develop this quid pro quo relationship with? Everybody is looking for content these days. I really think that every organization is, if not first and foremost, then definitely a big component of what they do is being a media company. And with that, everybody has the content wheel that they need to keep spinning, right? So how can you position your show to fit the content needs that someone else has? One example of this from our show, we did an episode on civics education. It was one of our first episodes, actually. And I sent it to the National Council on Social Studies, which is an umbrella group for K-12 social studies teachers, and just cold emailed their marketing person, and they really liked the episode and ended up putting it in their newsletter, which went out to something like 10,000 teachers across the country. So I think that really speaks to, like, everybody has this content need. And like, that is an audience that episode in particular was particularly pitched to and relevant to. So how can you think about, rather than just blasting out your show on your particular show's social feeds, how can you be more creative about making those connections? And it's more than just finding them, right? I know I just said I cold emailed someone. That works sometimes, but a lot of these other relationships are much longer tail. So back to the point about Self-Promotion Tuesday, nobody wants to be that person that just goes in there and drops what they're doing and then leaves and never engages again. A lot of this stuff is really about generally being interested in what people are saying and building those relationships so that when it does come time to make that ask to say, hey, I do this thing, can I share it here? Do you mind if I share my show? Or here's an episode that people might enjoy in this community. It's going to be a much easier ask. You're going to feel better about doing it because you've already built that relationship. You've already given these people something of your time or your expertise or some other piece of value. And they're going to feel better about it too, because they know that you're not just using them for your own ends. I mean, that is an outcome here, I suppose, but it's not the only outcome, right? There is a genuine back and forth, a genuine relationship to be built. And then the other people in the group are going to be more receptive to it as well, because they know you, they've interacted with you before, they kind of understand what you're about and how that works. And so they're going to be more receptive to that content in the end. And that's certainly been my experience as I've gotten to work with cross-promotional partners in the democracy and civic engagement space. We happened to, I think, start our show at a pretty good time after the 2016 election. There was a lot of renewed interest in, well, what is democracy? How do we make it better? How do we fix it type of things? We've been able to capitalize on a lot of those connections to help grow our show over the past 2 years. But they exist for everybody, big or small. There are communities out there for everybody. One of the things that there was kind of an inside joke in the newsroom that I used to work at, we would say that there was an association for everything. If we were working on a story about, I don't know, influx of tree squirrel populations that was like having some impact on our community, right? So there would be like a national association of tree squirrel farmers or breeders or whatever. There's, but I say all that to say there's professional organizations out there. Human beings are inherently social animals. We want to connect with one another. We want to talk about best practices and other things in our profession, or even, personally as well. So whatever your show is about, I'm going to bet there's at least one organization, if not many more out there devoted to that particular topic. And then you have to actually talk to people too. Just like, if you're a reporter, you have regular communication with your sources. That's how they give you the inside scoop, right? Because you're talking with them, you build up rapport, you build up trust over time. And in my journalism classes I teach, this is always a big hurdle for the students to get over. Because we really don't spend a ton of time talking to strangers these days, especially pre all these virtual events. Like, how often would you go up to somebody you didn't know and strike up a conversation? That's harder to do when everybody's like, staring at their phones all day. But we're all podcasters, right? You literally spend your time talking into a microphone. So even if you're an introvert, it's not as bad as you think it is. I'm pretty introverted. When I first started in journalism, I was very nervous, very shy. It's kind of a character that I had to play for a while. And then over time, as I did it more, I got more and more used to it. And now I love talking to people about my podcast. I'll do it all day long. And it does get easier as you go along. But you have to, again, you have to put that effort in to get to know people and understand where they're coming from, be receptive to their ideas, be willing to take their feedback, good or bad, and be willing to kind of meet them where they are. But if you're passionate enough about what you do, your show, the particular niche that it's in, you should want to talk about it anyway. If that's not the case, then you might want to rethink your podcast or your goals for doing it. If it's not something you want to talk about all day long, that in my mind is a pretty big red flag. And then at the end of the day, it's not about you. You're, of course, you're the person behind your show, but you're putting it out there into the world to make a difference and to impact your listeners. And you want to find the listeners for whom your show can make the most impact, the people who are going to be most interested in it. Yeah, I guess like a download is a download in some respects, but if it's just somebody that listens to one episode and is like, meh, okay, I never have to hear that again. That's not, to my thinking, that the type of person you want, the type of listener you want. And this number of truly passionate fans is much smaller. You're not going to have the people come by the masses that are super interested in whatever your topic is. But I think that's okay, because you will build, like I said, those genuine connections, and those will hopefully propel you forward to make your show even better and make even deeper connections moving forward. And that all comes from that curiosity about, oh, well, who's out there, and keeping an eye on what you're reading. And I feel like at least once a week, I'll read something that's like, oh, I should reach out to this person, or I should introduce myself to this or that. And it's just kind of a skill you develop over time. And then you can keep a file of all those things. And as you have time, start to reach out or learn more about them. And you don't have to do it all at once. You can kind of do it however much you have time to do. Because I realize all of this is much more work than just queuing up social feeds or posting in the self-promotion threads or buying ads on whatever platform. And you should devote time to this as much as you realistically have the ability to do so while still making your show. So that balance is going to look different for everyone. But I think even a little bit of this type of marketing, you might be surprised how the impact that it makes, both from a growth perspective and audience perspective, but also just from a personal fulfillment perspective. You will be much more fulfilled making a genuine connection with someone who's receptive to your content than you will be making your 85th headliner gram or posting in every thread that you post in every single week. That stuff becomes drudgery after a while. It's not fun. It's not mentally engaging. Whereas this approach, at least I think, is much more so in that line. And so the other kind of extension of this, thinking like a journalist metaphor, is that your cross-promotional partners, you can think of them like your sources. They're here to help and give you information and facilitate sharing back and forth in a way that's mutually beneficial. I'm not talking about, though, all the professional podcast outlets. Those are great. You should definitely subscribe to Inside Podcasting and Podmove and Hot Pod and all these things, Pod News. That's great to keep up with what the industry is doing. Certainly Outliers updates fall in there too, what goes on in the Outlier Facebook community and elsewhere. But those are not places where you're going to find new listeners for your show, at least by and large anyway, because the people reading these outlets are other podcasters who already listen to a gajillion shows anyway. And even if they wanted to listen to your show, they probably don't have time to. So the return there is going to be minimal. Again, they can be good for just getting on the radar in the industry, which has its own benefits completely apart from audience growth. But if you're pitching these people thinking you're going to get tons of new listeners, that is not the case, at least in my experience. Anyway, others might feel differently, but I would not spend your energy trying to make connections with folks like this for audience growth purposes. Instead, think about what are the outlets that operate within your particular space. Is it, traditional media? Are there bloggers or other influencers? Are there other podcasts you can cross promote with? Are there YouTubers? What does that look like in your space? So for us, as I was saying, the democracy reform space, there are actually several news sites that are dedicated to democracy news. If you would have said that to me 2.5 or 3 years ago, I'd have told you you're crazy, but they are out there. They all have readers and subscribers. So we are engaging in cross-promotional relationships with them. And in some cases, this involves helping them see what a podcast can bring to their portfolio. If somebody runs a blog or news website and they don't do audio, it might not be an immediate kind of home run for them to see how audio can add value, how they can effectively cross promote. So be ready to think outside the box a little bit there and think about what's an equitable trading and an equitable trade you can set up between your show and whatever media partner you choose. with other podcasts, that's a little bit easier. You know, there's promo swaps and RSS swaps and all of those types of things that are pretty well established. And then if, you know, you're working with influencers, one thing I did not put on here are newsletter creators. There's tons of newsletters out there that are not about podcasting, that are about your particular space. So start subscribing to those, you know, start sending them notes or ideas or suggestions, build that relationship. You know, once you identify these sources, you go back to that funnel of, okay, you find them, then you reach out and engage. And then like a little bit later, you get to the, okay, here's how we can work together. But you have to establish that relationship and build that trust first before you can do that. A couple of caveats here before we wrap up. These are things from my own experience. You have to be transparent about what you're doing. So one strategy that has worked particularly well for me is posting on subreddits that are relevant to whatever our episode covers. This is one from an episode we did about the Brown versus Board of Education decision on school segregation. It was in line with the 65th anniversary, so I posted that in our education. And you can see that like I was pretty open about who I am and, you know, what I'm doing there and who I talk to and how it would add value to that particular community. And the Reddit community responded pretty well, actually. I didn't get kicked out or blocked. There were some comments of people asking questions or leaving feedback. I made sure to respond to those. But you have to follow through. So, you know, this is not something you should do like all the time, I would say. I tend to pick and choose like which episodes I think are going to be most high impact or where there's already a relevant community. Another place that worked well, so I mentioned at the beginning, we did an episode on neoliberalism. There were a couple of political theory subreddits that were pretty substantial that I posted that episode in. I actually went and searched our guest's name and saw, you know, what subs people were talking about her in, what the nature of those conversations was, and then picked my subs from there to post in. Again, performed very well. People were very grateful for the content, but again, it wasn't just posting in our podcasts in their big like discussion thread that they have every week where everybody shares their shows. It was taking a much more curated, conscious approach to what content people wanted and how what we're doing on our show intersects with conversations that are already happening out there in the world. You have to show up in person or virtually. So part of making relationships in these communities is offering yourself up as a resource or as, you know, finding some way to bring value. So that the picture on the left there was, I met a woman named Sarah Shane who teaches at a community college near Philadelphia. She taught a class on podcast listening for their Center on Learning and Retirement. So I, this past summer, went down and spoke to her class. She used her show in my class. I still hear from people in this group that they've remained listeners. The group, the photo on the right is a virtual event that I was part of last week. Again, you have to show up and, you know, do it for reasons other than simply promoting your podcast. You also can learn more about your topic or get suggestions for episodes or guests, or just genuinely make connections with people in your space. And then finally, follow through, do what you say you're going to do. If you tell somebody you're going to send them ideas or feedback on something, you have to actually do it. Otherwise, it breaks that relationship and all that rapport that you're building. It's not all about you. Support the people who are supporting you. I think the Outlier community is such a great example of that. And then keep that sense of curiosity alive as you are reading things or interacting with people or having conversations. Keep that nugget in the back of your mind about, okay, how does this relate to my show? How can I make a connection here? How can I make a partnership that will be beneficial to them and to me? and to listeners as well, because that's what it's all about, right? And then I touched on this at the beginning, but the other kind of piece of this in making relationships in these communities is that hopefully it will bring new listeners into podcasting as a whole. I know that we crossed the 1 million podcast mark several weeks ago, and there's more new podcasts than ever, but not the rate of new listeners doesn't seem to be keeping pace with that. So Rob from Lipson just wrote an article about this earlier this week that I was looking at, and that really resonated with me. So I've given a version of this talk in higher ed circles, and I talk a lot about how universities have the opportunity to bring a lot of new people into podcasting because we interact with so many different audiences, from students, faculty, staff, alumni, donors, visitors to campus. So some of those people listen to podcasts already, but some of them don't. So how can in this case, how can a university's podcast be that gateway into the genre as a whole to help bring in new listeners? I think there are parallels there in any type of industry. So, if you work in consulting, or if you work in real estate, whatever your business is, there's going to be some segment of your ideal listener base that not only do they not listen to your podcast, but they don't listen to any at all. So how can you position your show to be that one that finally gets them to go to the podcast tab in Spotify, or get them to look at that Apple app on their phone that they had no idea what that weird purple symbol was for a long time? How do you pass that enthusiasm and that curiosity you have on to those potential new listeners to get them into podcasting as a whole? And then, the community, the podcaster community as a whole benefits from that, because from your show, they're going to get recommendations for others. If you're part of a network like ours, they're going to see others that are also relevant to things that they're interested in. So always keep that in mind too, that you're looking to cultivate both existing podcast listeners and brand new podcast listeners as well. So I'll end here with the quote from Jay Akunzo, who runs a company called Marketing Showrunners, that great marketing is not about who arrives, it's about who stays. So this gets directly back to that quantity versus quality thing that we started with. Anybody can go out and buy their way to a bigger audience or figure out how to hack their way to it. But most of those are not going to be what I would describe as quality listeners. They're not going to be passionate about your show. They're not going to tell other people about it. They're not going to share it in their groups. So how can you utilize this reporter's mindset that I've just described to go after those listeners who are going to stick with you and are going to become your long-term subscribers, your colleagues, your friends, your connections within the podcast world? If you want to tweet this out later, please tag Jay. Don't tag me. I give him full credit for this line of thinking, but I really think that it holds true here. So just to summarize, if you're a reporter, you would never show up to an interview unprepared. The same mentality applies to promoting your show. You need to know what community you're talking to, what the discussions already are that are happening there, what the best way is for you to begin that conversation in a way that makes sense within the context of that particular group. And then show up and commit. It's that old shoe leather method, right? You have to get out there, talk to people, understand what their needs are, and perhaps adapt your content accordingly. You can decide how much of that you'll do or not, but it all applies. Just like in going back to the movie Spotlight, they knocked on every door in neighborhoods in Boston, and you might have to knock on a whole bunch of doors to get people that are going to become those true fans of yours. And just not every person that I certainly went up to and said, hey, do you mind if I interview you? Not everybody's going to say yes. Some people are going to say, heck no, get away from me. And not everybody's going to be open to your conversations about cross promotion or about your podcast. And that's okay. You can't let those things drag you down. You have to make sure that, you're able to take the good with the bad and focus on how you can build on the good, not dwell on the bad. And in the end, like I said, you'll not only get new listeners, but you'll hopefully make some genuine connections and people that you can turn to as your show continues to grow and to develop. So that's all that I have. Again, you can find me on social media. My website is there, our show's website. I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have or expand on any points that I covered.
Fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. Those that are listening, now's your time. You can ask a few questions. We have some time now, but Jenna, obviously this is your third time here. For those of you that are listening, now you know why this is our third time here. I think you hold the record, or you're tied for the record of speakers that have spoken at our festival. So thank you for that.
Sure.
Joe Test says thank you. Great content. I have a question though. This is, and it sounds cliche and stuff, but we talk about the new normal, right? What's going to happen? How is this going to affect you, this whole pandemic and everything that's going on with your line of work, when it specifically for Democracy Works and anything going forward?
Yeah, I mean, so the obvious is that we have shifted to remote recording, just like everybody else has, but it's been really interesting to see. I feel like in some respects, there's a lot more opportunities to do this, like relationship marketing that I've just been talking about, because the barriers to entry are so low now. Anybody can go to anybody's virtual event. You don't have to you're not bound by physical location. I think I'm at the precipice of having virtual event burnout. I need to maybe take a break here after this one for a little bit, because there is so much coming at you. Yeah, I think that certainly in the democracy space, there's a lot of energy right now about what's the election in November going to look like. Is it going to be vote by mail? Is it going to be mail and in person? Or is it going to vary state to state? And that's something that we're definitely going to be covering a lot on our show. We're also seeing the infodemic, as it were, about COVID-19 continue to escalate, with conspiracy theories and all these types of things. The hallmark of any democracy is a shared set of facts and information, and that's seeming like an increasingly difficult thing to do these days. So that's something we're going to be exploring more on our show as well.
Very nice. Now, can you see the Q&A
Yes.
section there? Okay. There's a question there for you.
Yeah. So how would you recommend working with large outlets, big websites to put up your podcast? Do some of the large outlets just post your podcast, or do they want to rev share? Yeah, I mean, so I think that there has to be some type of equity here. Like, I don't think I would just go out and pitch our show to the New York Times or to Vox or something like that. Like, you have to start small, and then hopefully it builds off of each other. So if we start with like these two sites that cover democracy, okay, people who read those sites might also work at some of these larger outlets, or that you can kind of go up in tiers from there. Or is there something else that you can bring to the table besides just your podcast, right? So like if you have a newsletter that, maybe your podcast gets 1,000 downloads an episode, but you have a newsletter that has 20,000 subscribers, or you have a big social following, or there's like something else you can throw in to make the pie equitable. Or maybe it is just so in the pocket for whatever this outlet covers that they can't help but say yes after they get to know you. But the larger an outlet is, the broader it tends to be in scope, by and large anyway. So I would be mindful of that as well, that making that argument that like this is specifically what your audience wants gets more difficult the larger the outlet becomes. So to wrap all of that up, I would say focus on starting small, getting some wins, and then scaling up from there.
During your presentation, you talked about you kind of putting on a show a little bit when it comes, because you're an introvert a little bit, and you have to kind of turn it on from time to time. And I think a lot of us can relate there as well. And there's some burnout from that as well. But how do you go about it? And when do you start getting comfortable with, I know that you speak quite a bit and you're in front of a lot of people all the time, at least before all of this. Does it get easier? What are some of the tricks that you're using specifically, whether it's, your voice on a podcast or you on stage?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So before in my current role, I worked in the admissions office at Penn State for about 6 years. So I gave presentations to people several times a week to groups of 150 or 200. So I feel like it took me at least 6 months of doing that regularly before I really felt comfortable getting up in front of people and speaking. It took me a year as a reporter, and even now, like, I still get nervous calling people. If I have to like call someone up to interview them, like, I put it off, I procrastinate. I just, for whatever reason, that is still like a barrier for me, because I really don't like talking on the phone that much. And even like, going out, if one of the things I have my students do is a man on the street interviews, or just go up to random people and ask them questions. And I do a couple to kind of show them. And I just think about, like, how do you be someone that you would want to talk to, right? So if you're in a bad mood or you're grumpy, like, why would somebody want to give you the time of day? But if you smile and you're nice and you can be warm and make it easy for them to talk to you, that helps. But I think that the first one is always the hardest. And maybe there's a way that you can start in a sort of somewhat comfortable or supportive environments. Again, I think that these virtual events are great for doing that. You can get used to talking to people you don't know. Or go to a virtual networking event or something like that, or go to several of them. Heck, I mean, if you have the time on your hands, look for them. Anybody can sign up by and large. Or find the ones that are open and just start talking. And it does get easier as you go along.
Well, Jenna, we're big fans of who you are and what you do. Obviously, being with us 3 times speaks volumes to how we feel about you and everything you're doing. You're more than welcome on our physical stage, on our virtual stage in 2021 and beyond. So thank you for being on.
All right. Thanks, Ever.
Yeah, we'll talk to you later.
See ya.